Dr. Graham Hill is a criminologist and former senior investigating officer with the Surrey Police. During his career, Graham worked to solve some of the UK's most high-profile and infamous crimes, including the murder of 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿 and the London night stalker Delroy Grant.
Someone has to be in charge, someone has to bring the investigation towards its ultimate conclusion.
Graham, who specialises in child abduction and murder, assisted the Portuguese police in the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. In this series, he's using his own insider knowledge and expertise to unpack the investigation from the inside out.
The public only ever sees the tip of the iceberg. I want to tell the full story and reveal how detectives brought a series of elusive killers to justice.
This is Murder Detective. Canning Town is located in the borough of Newham in East London. Over the centuries, it has developed to serve the Royal Victoria Dock. With that has come some social challenges such as poverty, low education and subsequent poor health for its inhabitants. So much so, it's considered to be one of the most deprived areas of the UK.
There's so many problems. All you hear every night when you're there is police sirens. All day, all night. There's just always problems, always things going on. It's just a shame because people want to live in that area, but other people spoil it.
There is still a sense of a subculture in existence there. Very poor residents on the whole, many living on benefits.
Dr. Graham Hill is driving to the south of Canning Town. It was in this area in April 2019 that detectives were called to investigate a suspicious death. Graham is meeting the senior investigating officer who was put in charge of the case, Simon Harding.
Simon, here we are at Vendome Close, Canning Town. Can you tell me what you found when you came here on the afternoon of the 27th of April 2019?
The local officers have been called here the day before on the 26th of April 2019 by a lady, somebody who was an associate of Zahid Yunus who lived inside the flat. And she was concerned for his safety. And officers went there on the 26th. They couldn't see anything visibly from outside. They knocked on a few doors. And in policing, really, he wasn't at the highest end of a concern. He wasn't a high risk at that point. But it goes on then into the next day, the 27th of April. And the officers just felt at that point, well, nothing's changed. There is a concern for his health. And they felt that they should break into the premises and have a look around just to make sure and check on his welfare. The officers went through the front window. Once he went in, he let his colleagues in. They searched around the flat. It was in quite a mess, but obviously there was no people there, and they could make that assessment very quickly. It's a one-bedroom flat.
They probed a little deeper and came across in a cupboard a big chest freezer. They discovered the unusual side that this freezer had a padlock on it.
It was kind of goes back to that old-fashioned kind of hunch thing that you don't really see very often. The officers went outside, got a crowbar, come back in, and then straight away saw, after a slight bit of movement of some cloth, that there was a human foot sticking up in a sock.
Immediately, the scene became a crime scene. Officers withdrew. Crime scene cordons were put in place.
And then the chain would then eventually end up to a murder team in London being called down to that scene. And that's when my own team were deployed down there to do all the work that is necessary to start building that picture of what's happened.
So when you arrived, what were your early thought processes? What were you thinking about as an SIO, decisions, policy, that kind of stuff?
When you have a call of an incident like this when someone's in a freezer, it's particularly unusual. It doesn't fall into the main frame of different murders that you do have out on the street. So you've got lots of thoughts. Really, the main thought you have is a concern about, or the person that's done this, that has the ability or the mindset to put somebody in a freezer. Where are they? And I need to get them as quickly as possible, especially when you don't really know much about them at those very early stages. Are they a danger to other members of the public, the local community, or even the wider community?
With the homicide team alerted, Simon Harding's primary need was to call in his crime scene manager to secure the area and evaluate the possible evidence available.
They are in charge, essentially, of that crime scene. All the forensic examinations that take place, the forensic retrievals, they go into the flat. I won't go in at that stage at all. There's no need for me to go into that crime scene to start, again, contaminating potentially or anything like that. So I stay outside, and they are my eyes and ears inside that venue, that they can then tell me what they've seen and really what I'm looking at.
As crime scene manager, you'd enter the scene, obviously wearing full protective clothing, with a detective from the homicide assessment team. And it's just to make an initial visual examination, whether you can see blood, what sticks out to you. But at this point, what you're also to consider, body in the freezer. How did it get here? Was she murdered somewhere else? If she was murdered somewhere else, you're looking at another scene. If murdered somewhere else, brought to this address. How did she get here? Vehicles. So the scenes are starting to build in your mind, and strategies need to be put into place about how you're going to deal with those other scenes if they do come to light.
In a scene like this, the crime scene manager would assess what kind of specialisms that they would want to help them. In particular, we would have video photographers there, still photographers, people to help the crime scene manager to do fingerprints, DNA swabs. At that time, it's so complex, that particular scene, with the nature of the freezer and the fact that inside that flat was a total mess. So it becomes a very difficult thing to make assumptions straight away, and you need to know an awful lot more, and that's really where everything starts from.
So, of course, at this stage, you can't identify the body in the freezer, so that's going to prove problematic for you building up your victimology, isn't it?
It is, and that's one of the reasons why you want to do this quickly, want to try and find out who that person is. But in this particular case, I mean, it's just harrowing the way that you couldn't identify the body due to the way in which it was within the freezer and the fact the body was frozen and covered in blankets.
Simon and his team were racing against the clock. Not only was it crucial to secure the freezer and its surrounding area, but they also needed to preserve the body inside.
It was clear that the power had been off for some time, and what you wanted to avoid straight away was any form of thawing out or decomposition to take place there and then. We needed to preserve as much as we could until we got it into an area where we could control what happened with that freezer and then the forensic retrieval from inside the freezer.
To remove the freezer to the mortuary could have caused some kind of problems, but it was quite contained. So the decision was made that we would move the whole item to the mortuary rather than have a pathologist come to the scene and maybe to start taking initial samples. So the freezer is now at the mortuary and we need to x-ray the freezer. So again, specialist photographers from our scientific imaging team also do x-rays. So x-ray machine was brought to the morgue and the freezer was x-rayed.
That was when police realised there was not one, but two bodies. A second one underneath, both frozen solid, clearly been there for months, if not years, and fused together.
That really is when you think, what are we dealing with here? You know, it's obviously something which is incredibly unusual, but now you're dealing with something which is incredibly sinister.
It was the discovery of not just one body, but two, that the investigation was elevated from suspicious to one of murder. And crucially for Simon Harding, the location of the flat's occupier, Zahid Yunus, was still unknown. Criminologist and former senior investigating officer Dr. Graham Hill has been granted exclusive inside access to a double murder in Canning Town, London, which occurred in the spring of 2019. The gruesome discovery of 2 women murdered and tightly packed inside a freezer had been quickly passed to the homicide team led by SIO Simon Harding. The occupant of the flat, Zahid Yunus, was nowhere to be found.
2 bodies in the freezer was obviously quite a shock and unexpected. So again, a decision now had to be made about how they were going to remove the bodies from the freezer. This decision was taken by the pathologist, a forensic archaeologist and an anthropologist. The bodies had to be left to thaw until they could be separated. And they were obviously removed one at a time.
Having got the freezer from the flat and taken it to a mortuary, you're then left with the flat as a crime scene. How do you brief your crime scene manager and what gets done then?
You're looking to say, right, what's the rest of the premises look like? And what can we see, visibly see, in front of us? But also there's that other element of what you can't see. What you can't see to the naked eye. There might be something blood cleaned up. And you start to use processes like luminol testing, which can show up blood which has been potentially cleaned or washed away. And when I went into the flat after the freezer had been removed, you could see straight away this is going to be complicated. There's so many items, lots of things that look like rubbish. It was going to be difficult.
One of the key priorities for SIO Simon Harding at this stage in the case was to begin the victim identification process.
There's different ways that you can try and link bits of information. So, for example, you'd start looking at missing persons reports in that area of London. You'd have a list and they'd have descriptions of people, and you could see certain parts. Well, firstly, it was a female and there's possibly dark hair. That's all you could see to start with. Because they were so frozen, that's about it. You knew that was going to take time. So where else do you find your information to understand who those 2 girls are? And so inside the flat, there was a handbag and there was a blister pack of medication made out to a woman called Mustafa. It was quickly established that Mustafa is also a missing person and also fitted the description as best as we could see at that stage. And it's a fair assumption then that you think, well, this is more than likely going to be Mirshan.
I was at work that day. I was on the train coming home. And like you do when you're on the train with everyone else, you're sitting on your phone, literally just... And an article come up in the local newspaper about some bodies had been found in a freezer in Custom House. Didn't think nothing of it at all. Just read the article. And I thought, we had a liaison officer at the time. I thought, let me just ring him anyway, just to let him know maybe... As I picked up my phone to go and call him, he rang me. And I said, hi, Jason. I said, that's really weird. I said, I was literally just about to call you. And he said, is there any chance that you could get to Mills for about 7:30? I was like, yeah, why? And he goes, some police officers are going to go down to Mills. We need you to be there for 7:30. Can you make it? I said, what are they going there for? He goes, they need to talk to you. I said, for a joke. I was like, don't say it's anything to do with that, is it? He went, I can't say. Well, as soon as he said that, you knew. I went, it is, isn't it? He goes, I'm not allowed to say.
What do you think was the important part of your strategy around family liaison? Because that's always difficult, particularly as one of the victims was a missing person.
It's always important to get that part of your strategy right about how you then make contact with families who think that their loved one has been killed. It's one of the most difficult parts. You need the family with you on that journey of the investigation.
And they need to be confident that you know what you're doing and you're going to do the best for them, don't they?
Yes, first impressions with a family when I meet them is important.
As soon as I got to Mills, they started explaining to us what they'd found, what had happened. And it wasn't confirmed at the time, but they just said, due to some evidence that they'd found at the property, it is most likely that it can be Jan. And then I was in one room crying, I could hear Mel in the other room crying with the police. It was shock, because 1 minute you're on a train going home on a normal day, and then 2 hours later you've just been hit with this news.
While the evidence pointed to one of the bodies being 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿, or Jan as she was known by her family and friends, Simon and his team still needed a formal identification.
While the missing investigation was going on, the police had already, before even Jan had been found, just in case of anything like this ever happening, they took DNA from Mel, and they also took DNA from Jan's mum. So they had 2 DNA samples on file.
We could match and confirm that it was the body of 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿 Mustafa. So we knew that the body on top was that of who was known as Jan to her family, so we knew that was Jan.
Me and Jan grew up together as cousins. We'd always go around each other's houses at the weekend, spend time together. I've got a passion for music, and I love music. I do DJing. Jan's passion for music was dancing, so we were always clubbing. We'd hire out venues, we'd do our own parties together. She would hire out little halls and teach children street dance. So I think that's where we become even closer, because we had so much in common.
She was a single mother trying to do the best for her children, but sadly got behind with her rent, so she made a decision to move in with her mother for a while. During this period, she became quite depressed and sadly turned to alcohol and drugs. The drugs she bought from a friend of Eunice's who lived quite close by, and this is how she came to be involved with Eunice.
Jan Mustafa had been reported missing by her family on the 10th of May 2018.
I was on Facebook one day and I spotted a poster that someone had posted up saying that Jan was missing. And I was like, oh, I wonder what this is about. So I contacted Mel straight away. And that's when I jumped on board, and then it was me and Mel following on. It was just 1 year of hell looking for her.
Simon and the family liaison officers within his team quickly formed a line of communication and trust with Jan's family.
It was clear that they were so far in front of us in terms of knowing everything. When I spoke to them, they produced 2 or 3 huge folders of evidence, pictures, things they'd been doing for the best part of 11 months. And it was testament to the love they had for their sister, that they and cousin, that they wanted to try and find her. So they were able to actually help us understand who was who in her life, and that really helped us understand that Zahid Yunus didn't seem to appear in any part of this at all. He was completely unknown to the sister and the cousin at the time.
The other thing that appears to have been an important part of this investigation was piecing together the information and the intelligence, so phone harvesting, the data from the mobile phones, and building up a picture of the suspect. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's important to link your suspect to your victims. You look at what is in the intelligence that the police have about him, but then you start looking at other things, such as telephones. And what we could see with 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿 to start was that there is contact between 𝗞𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗿 and Zahid Yunus in terms of phone calls.
We quickly established from that telephone number that it was being used on the 2nd of May 2018, and the cell site mask, which is what your phone pings off of, was that services Van Dome Close. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can see there's a phone call between 𝗞𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗿's phone and the phone number that we had for Zahid Yunus. They were talking to each other, and that's the last form of communication on the 2nd of May 2018 that ever came from that phone. And then 𝗞𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗿 was reported missing on the 10th of May.
Simon discovered that the police had missed an opportunity which had happened previously.
On the 5th or 6th week, When Jan went missing, they called Zahid's number. Hi, how can I help you? Oh, nice. Anything I can do for you? Oh, yeah, we're looking. There's a girl missing called Jan. Oh, yeah, I've seen the posters about her. Oh, do you know her? No, not really. I know her. I've seen her once or twice with another friend that Jan hanged about with at the time. And he goes, oh, the number's on your phone. He's like, oh, yeah, sometimes when her friend would come round, if she was looking for Jan, she'd ring her from my phone because she ain't got credit. Literally, that was it.
They even said, well, if you ever see her again, please remember to let us know. While all the time, Jan was already in the freezer.
I have sympathy with 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗹𝗲𝗏's family. When she was reported missing, I don't think they were given the response that they really should have got. But in this particular case, I don't think that had the Met risk assessed her disappearance differently, that they would have prevented her from being killed. But I do think that potentially, had they done those inquiries around her phone and made the necessary links between her and Eunice, then almost certainly they may have got to her or found her body sooner.
For Simon Harding and the homicide team, they still had another body from the freezer to identify. And meanwhile, Zahid Yunus was still at large. SIO Simon Harding and his team had identified one of two bodies found in a flat in Canning Town, London. But they still had to find their suspect, 36-year-old Zahid Yunus.
I understand that the locals gave you quite a bit of information about Eunice.
Yeah, once we had established who the resident was of the flat, Zahid Yunus, then we were able to speak more directly to people about, do you know Zahid Yunus? You know, what interaction have you had with him? What kind of person was he? And we got quite a lot of information back, really in the early stages, that he was somebody who was a nuisance in this area, and lots of things had happened where there was screaming from him and shouting outside the flat, disturbing everybody. So we got a lot of information about him.
Zahid Yunus was in his early 30s. He used to go by Boxer because he loved boxing, and he had a tattoo with Boxer on his neck. He also used to go by the name Ali, some known him as Ali. I take it from Muhammad Ali from boxing.
Yunus had been offending as far back as 2001. He'd been in prison for a 3-month period. Any previous partner he'd spoken to, there seems to be violence against all of these women. He'd actually married a child bride at 14. He was having a relationship with her when she was a sexual relationship with her when she was 13 years old.
He was soon after that targeting other teenage girls and subjected another one to the most horrendous nightmare existence, so much that she jumped from a window to try and escape. He dragged her back inside and forced her to eat off the floor like a dog.
The intelligence around Zahid Yunus showed that he was a systematic abuser of women. He chose those people that were vulnerable, the ones that wouldn't report him, the ones that needed a roof over their head, needed the drugs, needed to feel like somebody wanted them. He was a registered sex offender after one of his cases, and he was being visited as a low risk, and was visited almost like once a year, really, to make sure he has conditions that he has to do, but he was never really on that radar because there weren't enough people coming forward about what he had done to them.
While detectives started to gather evidence of their suspect, Zahid Yunus, the team also needed to uncover the identity of the second body found in the freezer.
There were a few identification marks on her, but when compared against missing persons reports, there was nothing that showed up. And so that was a more difficult process to try and identify the second body formally. So then we started to look at the intelligence. What does the intelligence around Zahid Yunus look like? And we had to go back quite a long time in fact, to 2016 to see the last time that the police could say in company with a female, and that was around about 29th of August 2016. And of course, as the SO, you think, well, that's ages away. I need stuff which is closer and more relevant. But in fact, a name came up as a female called Henriette Szucs. She had been the victim of crime quite badly on a number of occasions through domestic abuse. And then one of those cases, she'd had to give her own DNA sample. So we used that sample of DNA against the sample taken from the second body, and it matched. And so at that point, we knew that was Henriette Szucs.
Now let's talk a little bit about victimology. What did you learn about Henriette?
Well, firstly, going back in date, really, Henriette, we found out early on that she was a Hungarian national, that she'd been in the UK for probably 2 years, up to the point of her death, having come back to the UK from Hungary. She was trying to get her passport sorted out, some sort of something where she could present to people to say, this is me, I'm not just a visitor to the country. But what you could see was that she was vulnerable, she was susceptible to drugs, and being vulnerable and potentially homeless quite a lot, she also became a victim to other men who would commit domestic abuse on her. And Zahid Yunus was no different to them, but he took it to a completely different level.
She left Hungary to come to Germany to start with, before she came to the UK in 2012, when she started working as a sex worker in East London. She went back to Hungary and had one of her children adopted, and then came back to the UK in 2014, where she met another man who she moved in with, and sadly became a victim of his domestic violence, and at some time was either thrown or pushed out of a 5th floor window, in which she suffered some horrific injuries.
She then ends up in the Royal London Hospital and meets a man that she thinks is going to be now, for the first time in her life, Sir Galahad, the White Knight, who will ride to her rescue and give her the love and the support and the security that she's always dreamt of and has never had in her short life. Little knowing that he was at that time, of course, not only a convicted sex offender, but a predator on exactly a vulnerable woman that she was.
Once discharged from hospital, she went to live in a safe house down in Bristol, but she was still in contact with Eunice via phone and email.
Henriette was a really lovely and really quite positive young lady who always came into the day centre with a smile. What Henriette wanted at the time when she came was somewhere to be. Clearly she wanted somewhere much more stable to live. She wanted to get a job, support herself. She spent her time drawing. She laughed a lot. She really did. She brought joy to us at the day centre. So the last time that we saw Henriette was August 2015, and she came into the day centre. She came in for a food parcel. She said she was happy, she had found somebody, and she even actually left the address of that person.
Inside that flat was loads and loads of torn up bits of paper and a diary of Henriette, and you could see within the diary of the bits that weren't torn out that she liked poetry, but the poetry got darker and darker as it went on. So lots of love for him when you can see in the early months when she was with him, getting to the point at the end where she's terrified of him. And because there were so many torn up bits of paper, we had desks dedicated to building a jigsaw back of all these, and they could be relevant, they might not be, but actually what they did do is they described what kind of pain she went through with him.
As the weeks of the poems and the letters and diaries went on, had to sit in a corner today, he got upset, don't want to upset Boxer, I'm really hungry, but if I eat I'll be told off, isolated, not allowed out today, have to stay home, better clean up before he tells me off.
Eunice subjected her to a torment of abuse physical injuries and, of course, the mental torture that went with his controlling behaviour. And within just a small number of months, she would be dead.
Detectives were starting to piece together a profile around their suspect, Zahid Yunus, and the two identified victims. A timeline of events was starting to become clear.
Another crucial piece of evidence was when he purchased the freezer.
Yeah, Henriette's timeline was kind of stopped around August, 29th of August, the last time we knew about her. And then we could see also that there were some diary entries towards the end of September, and then everything stopped. And then we look at the freezer itself. What you could see was that freezer was purchased locally in a big superstore on the 10th of November. And that really was very, very close to the last time that Henriette was seen. So was the freezer purchased for the sole use of putting Henriette in? And I believed it was when I found out that time, because also the freezer was purchased using a false name, false address, and using cash. The box that freezer came in was still there 2.5 years later inside that flat. And the plastic wrapping around that box that the freezer came in was actually wrapped around Henriette's body inside the freezer.
While some pieces of the puzzle are in plain sight, there are also unforeseen complexities to the case, such as the post-mortem results.
There's no proper cause of death yet, and that's very difficult in a murder inquiry, especially for the SIO, because most murders are very clean cut. You know how somebody's died, but when you've got two bodies which have essentially, because the power has gone on and off in the flat, there's been decomposition and refreezing. It's just gone randomly, and especially over 2.5 years, it became very, very difficult for the pathologist to really understand, even though you could see all these injuries, how they actually died.
Back at the flat in Vendome Close, Canning Town, the crime scene investigation team made another disturbing discovery.
This crime scene manager is now working through the items that are being found inside the flat itself. Once they're starting to clear everything away and take those exhibits which they think are important, working out into that lockup outside. And inside that lockup was 2 or 3 rolled up pieces of carpet. When you put the carpets down in the rooms where they came from, and then they underwent luminol testing and other forensic testing to look at the blood and patterns that there might be, you could see there were several spots in each carpet of the blood belonging to Henriette Szucs. Henriette Szucs had over 50 external injuries where she would have been in extreme pain and she would have bled a lot. There was just blood all down the hallway, in the lounge where all these carpets were originally before they'd been pulled up. So you can't imagine the horror that was taking place inside that flat between Zahid Yunus and Henriette Szucs. He used his victims as punch bags. You could see the broken ribs down both Mirishan and Henriette. A lot of ribs, all but 2 broken on Henriette.
In light of this harrowing evidence, it had become crucial for the police to find Zahid Yunus as quickly as possible, before he could harm anybody else. But the net was closing in on his location. SIO Simon Harding was closing in on a double murder suspect, Zahid Yunus, who had not been seen since the bodies of 2 women were discovered in his apartment in Vendome Close in Canning Town. Simon's team is about to make a breakthrough in the case.
You look at the obvious places where he might be, so it might be a job centre, it might be a friend's house, and obviously family's house. He was eventually found in West London. Officers intercepted him. There was a bit of a struggle. He's 6'4", he's a big guy. And, you do as an SIO, you kind of breathe a slight sigh of relief at that point to think, right, I'm now in control of him. and that's the most important part. But that is also, in this case, faced up against that you don't have the evidence at the moment to charge him with murder. So you start to look at other offences, and in particular, prevention of a lawful burial. It's quite an old piece of legislation, but it's still very, very relevant. That was enough at that time for the CPS to say, right, okay, yeah, it's his flat, he's on his own, there's links between him and the two girls, so as far as we're concerned, that's enough to keep him in custody at the moment.
Getting that initial charge, that holding charge for preventing a lawful burial, was such a relief, because it allowed the team to concentrate and not rush, but make meticulous inquiries into all the aspects of the case. They'd worked so hard to get as much evidence as possible, disproving everything that we could think of that could be another reason for why these two women are in the freezer, to then say, well, this is him, this is what we found, these are the forensics inside the flat. All these things presented together allowed the CPS to say, right, well, we think we've got enough now to charge him with murder.
When Zahid Yunus appears as the person in the newspaper who's been charged with preventing a lawful burial, people do come forward and you start to build up a picture, and somebody knows somebody else that's been abused, so you go and visit them. But you are talking about people who are terrified. They are terrified of Zahid Yunus, what he did to them physically and psychologically. Some people who knew him years ago have still never recovered from what he did to them. But then you try and encourage them to be strong. The more that come forward, the more chance there is that he will stay in prison. And so we had a number of people that wanted to come forward and a number that gave evidence.
Let's talk about trial prep. What's the general feeling of how you're going to present your case?
I think any murder inquiry, that's the most important thing that you look towards at the end. You don't need a motive, you just need to prove that one person killed another person. But in this case it's different because we didn't have a cause of death. And so with this case you start bringing in all of your information that you have about his past, getting as many people to court as possible who can talk about his past and what kind of violent, controlling, coercive person he was.
Zahid Yunus's trial began in August 2019 at the Old Bailey Central Court in London.
Yunus put on such a show of bravado, of arrogance and contempt for the entire proceedings. He thought he knew how to handle the criminal justice system. And one of his tricks that he was going to play was that he would delay proceedings as long as possible in the hope that maybe they might drop the charges. A forlorn hope, but he managed to sack not one but two of his legal teams. It was only when a third legal team was appointed and the judge warned him that this was going to be the team that's going to represent him come what may, that he then had to agree to the trial taking place.
He just liked to waste time. One of his ex-partners came in to give evidence one day and he saw her at court, and by the time it was her turn in the afternoon to speak, he didn't want to face her, so he decided to go toilet on himself. There was no change of trousers for him, so he was allowed to go home that day, so court was cancelled. So again, he knows how to play the system.
The prosecution team worked tirelessly to prove Yunus's guilt to the jury.
One of the important things was, how do you pull all those strands of evidence together? And particularly when it comes to the forensic strategy for this investigation, there were a number of experts that had to come and give evidence at court. So you had a forensic pathologist, you had an expert in bones, you had a blood DNA specialist, you had fingerprint experts. All of those people had to come to court and give evidence. And really what it tells us is that the investigation team relied very heavily on the science to prove their case.
It was an immensely strong case, and as the evidence mounted against him, Yunus reacted, as bullies often do, with a bluster. He started shouting at these witnesses who were giving traumatic evidence, but compelling evidence against him, shouting from the dock across the court at them, and then he started shouting at the judge.
Then the jury go out, and that's the time when you're with a family and they look at you and think, have you done enough? You're looking at him thinking, I hope you know that we have done enough, and it's that tense time. And I honestly thought this won't be long. 5 days we waited.
Finally, the jury was ready to deliver a verdict.
We've all sat there, we was literally shaking in court. And then the guy got up and it was like, yeah, guilty. So my cousin shouting and screaming, she's like, shh, be quiet, gonna get told off. So he's sitting there, again, nothing. Sent him down. 20 minutes later, we all went back in. He wouldn't come out from his cell downstairs. He decided he wasn't coming back.
Eunice proved that at heart he will always be a coward by refusing to come to court to face his sentencing and to stand in front of the families of the victims that he had killed.
So when he got found guilty, he must have been relieved. How did you feel when he got sentenced to 38 years imprisonment?
Yeah, I was delighted. I think it's a huge number. There's not many sentences that are that high, but I was very relieved.
But I thought there was a good comment by the judge that reminded him that he might never be released, given the type of crimes that he's committed. So maybe that he will never see the light of day.
Yeah, and that's right. And it's 38 years. That's on that day is the first time you can even ask for parole. Mm-hmm. Not the day that he walks out the doors. And he's got to behave himself pretty much, for a long, long period of time. And I don't think he's got it in him. He's not that type of person.
Zahid was given a life sentence. But was this enough for the families of the victims to get closure?
Zahid's never ever spoken about how he knew Jan, when did it happen, what happened. We don't know anything. So for us, we've been to court, he's been locked up, but we're still none of the wiser. We've got so many unanswered questions and we're never going to get the answer because he won't speak.
Henriette was a delight. When I talk about her and I think about her, I just see her lovely smiling face. She brought joy. How did poor, lovely Henriette end up like this? She did not deserve that.
It's really testament to officers that work on cases like this, and especially my team at the time. They felt really attached to Jan and to Henriette. There's nothing they wouldn't do to try and make sure that Eunice was convicted.
My professional opinion is that this was a well-conducted investigation. Sometimes investigators can try and force an investigation into a particular line of inquiry. In this case, what he allowed the investigation to do was to find its own level. And by that I mean what happened was the forensic science told the story. And once the forensic science tells the story, the job of the SIO is then to present that story in conjunction with experts who come to court, in conjunction with the Crown Prosecution Service and Prosecution Counsel. So it's a team game. And in this particular investigation, it was teamwork that brought this man to justice and secured a conviction.
Dr. Graham Hill is a criminologist and former senior investigating officer with the Surrey Police. During his career, Graham worked to solve some of the UK's most high-profile and infamous crimes, including the murder of 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿 and the London night stalker Delroy Grant.
Someone has to be in charge. Someone has to bring the investigation towards its ultimate conclusion.
Graham, who specialises in child abduction and murder, assisted the Portuguese police in the investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. In this series, he's using his own insider knowledge and expertise to unpack the investigation from the inside out.
The public only ever sees the tip of the iceberg. I want to tell the full story and reveal how detectives brought a series of elusive killers to justice.
This is Murder Detective.
New Cross in London is an inner city neighbourhood just south of the River Thames in the borough of Lewisham. Demographically, it's one of the poorer areas of London. However, it's also acknowledged to be a creative hub, thanks largely to the university at its centre, Goldsmiths, famous for its drama, dance and arts. Like most inner city areas, New Cross also has a dark side.
In 2000, New Cross had a particular high crime rate, mainly due to crack cocaine. And because of the drug problem in the area, it had a high rate of crime and a high rate of burglary.
The Lewisham New Cross area is a real mix of wealthy people, but on the other side it's that inner London, inner city band with a lot of social housing and also a lot of crime.
Those areas were rough areas, a lot of gangs, a lot of murders, a lot of them sort of knife-related shootings. Not probably as much as there is now, but there certainly was quite a few shootings in those days.
On Friday night, the 10th of November 2000, emergency services were called to an incident on New Cross Road. It was reported that there had been a vicious attack on a member of the staff at a venue known at the time as the Paradise Bar.
The Paradise Bar was a kind of hybrid between a club and a bar, basically. Shop front on the corner, entrance fee which was normal on a Friday, Saturday night, just to make sure they had that bit more income, but more importantly they could challenge the clientele that was coming in as well.
The doorman at the Paradise Club on New Cross Road was stabbed around about 10:30 on the 10th of November 2000.
There's an immediate response from the uniform guys, and in this case they will have assessed very quickly that this was a life-threatening assault involving violent criminals.
What was described to the police was that he was lying in a pool of his own blood on the pavement outside the club, and that he'd been attacked by a group of 4 young men who had brought with them a pit bull dog.
They cordoned off the area and they called in the duty on-call homicide team.
The objective there is to secure the scene, identify potential witnesses and secure possible evidence.
At that time, we brought in the homicide assessment team, which was a car staffed by murder investigation detectives that were on the shift system, and they were the first response in that golden hour. They would work with the uniform officers to seal off the area, preserve any kind of forensic exhibits, and then they would report to the on-call senior investigating officer.
They look at the scene, it's clearly an attempted murder, if not a murder, and they call the on-call SIO, who is Will O'Reilly. So Will, here we are at a very busy and noisy New Cross Road in South East London. On the 10th of November 2000, there was an incident outside the premises behind you, which was then called the Paradise Club. One of the things I always say, it's really important for SIOs to walk the crime scene and get a feel for the investigation.
Well, first of all, it's preservation of life, to see who else was injured, of course, and make sure that they're being dealt with satisfactorily. And then it was trying to actually clamp the scene down so we don't lose anything.
So you're talking about cordons?
We're talking about cordons, appeal for witnesses. It's a busy road, for instance. Are witnesses leaving the scene that we should keep them there?
Were you thinking about forensic opportunities?
Yes,
at that
absolutely.
point?
Depending on the weather, it could have been drizzling or whatever. I can't remember the exact weather that night, but we wanted to preserve what we can immediately on that scene and a second cordon surrounding it. My initial thoughts was to make those urgent policy decisions and record those policy decisions. You've got to get those decisions right and in place, and that will affect the whole investigation. We've had a busy bar. We've got potentially lots and lots of witnesses. So we had to sort of go through those to see if anybody could assist us. We had the other bouncer at the scene who had some minor injuries, but obviously an incredible source of intelligence for us and a potential witness. And then it was really to try and, preserve the scene as best we could. It's very dark at this stage at all. You don't know what you're going to find in daylight. So to preserve some of the scene and do whatever forensication we could that night.
It's called the golden hour. Those first steps at the scene of a crime are vitally important because you can lose evidence very, very quickly. You can lose witnesses and you can lose the forensic capabilities of that scene. So my first step was to really put the cordons in place, secure whatever witnesses we've got, make some appeals around to the locals, initial house-to-house inquiries to see if anybody had saw anything that we were perhaps to lose at a later stage, and really secure the forensic evidence.
The doorman who had been attacked was 36-year-old George Napier. George, often known as a gentle giant, was rushed to hospital with life-threatening injuries following the incident, but tragically was pronounced dead on his arrival.
George Napier was born in Scotland. He was a family man. He had 3 children and lived with his partner in the Tottenham area of London. He was working as a doorman part-time, but he had aspirations of becoming a lawyer.
Although he was physically pretty big and imposing, he was very caring, thoughtful, friendly towards everyone he knew.
As so often happens, it can be one punch or one stab, and they hit the right place and that's it, and the victim's dead.
In cases like that, whenever there's a bereavement, when there's a death, one of the functions that the inquiry team will take up is liaising with the family, and the purpose of that is to keep them informed of the process.
One of the main persons I would have had on call with me that evening is a authorised and trained family liaison officer, such as I would have had an exhibits officer and significant witness interviewers, all parts of my core team who will be called out when a murder happens. So that person would have been briefed and deployed to go and track down the family if they hadn't already been told.
For anyone, someone getting killed is a complete shock, unexpected, and they won't be familiar with the procedure, not just the investigation, but how the death is handled by the various authorities.
The moment that George Napier dies in Lewisham Hospital, the murder investigation becomes a Cat B murder, which means that the offenders are likely to be known, and there's not a significant impact on the community as such. So the police are able to start a line of inquiry very quickly.
A Category A crime may attract a lot of public interest. A Cat B can still be a very complex investigation, but may not have that same level of profile. And then a Category C is generally where the suspects are known, and that may well and will often include a domestic murder.
The killing of George Napier in New Cross was nominated as a Category B unlawful death, and with SIO Will O'Reilly officially in charge of the case, the Golden Hour murder investigation began. Dr. Graham Hill is in New Cross with former Senior Investigating Officer Will O'Reilly, revisiting the murder case of doorman and father of 3 George Napier, who was viciously attacked by 4 men and a dog in November 2000. At the Paradise Bar on New Cross Road, The homicide team were attempting to secure a crime scene and preserve any possible evidence.
Will O'Reilly arrived at the scene around about an hour after the incident. At that point, he knew that George had died at Lewisham Hospital. He called a crime scene manager, someone to manage the scene, to manage the forensic examination, and he cordoned off the area. And typically he would have put an inner cordon close to the scene and an outer cordon, which would have been difficult because the Paradise Club is situated on a main road, and therefore it would have been difficult to cordon off.
You would have been aware, if you'd been the uniform relief inspector, the shift inspector on the area, that you had sufficient officers in case this turned into a disturbance, because some people don't like being told, no, you can't go there, you've got to go over there, you're not allowed in there. And there have been occasions where, certainly as detectives, you relied on uniform officers to ensure that there wasn't unrest in the area. You have a murder happening in the vicinity of a pub or a club where a lot of people are. You've got to sort out very quickly who are your main witnesses, who are the significant witnesses, some quick one-line interviews to say if they saw anything, and then we'd follow up that on a later stage in the inquiry if necessary. And they would have said, anyone see what happened? Anyone see who attacked George? Anything unusual about them? Can you describe them? And what came up was one of them had a dog, which was, I understand, American 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿.
With detectives starting to gather information, Will O'Reilly quickly appointed his crime scene investigator, 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿 Sutherland.
I received a phone call at home that there had been a stabbing at a pub in Deptford. I immediately go to the scene. Quite often you find that the information you get on a telephone, when you actually get to the scene, it's very different from what you either pictured in your head or from what you were told. So when I got there was still a few people around about, as I call the other bouncers, bar staff. I spoke to some of them about what had happened, what did you see, to give me an idea of, well, where did my victim land, where did these parts of incidents take place, were they already in the pub? And did they come back? Because if they were already in the pub, where were they sat? What were they drinking? Because I may be able to find bottles or glasses still in that area that could put those people in the pub, because they may well say at a later, no, I was never in that pub, don't know what you're talking about.
Crucially, in this case, they had a significant witness who was the other doorman who was working the door with George, who was involved in the incident but wasn't severely injured.
And it was this witness who was able to reveal a possible motive for the attack to the crime scene team.
Earlier on that night, George had refused entry to the club to a man called Spencer, who had a dog.
George, who was the doorman, said, well, you're not coming in, and he didn't like that, neither did his friends, and they all went off.
And very shortly after, he returned with a larger group and a dog.
We didn't know who stabbed who at that stage. Even the other bouncer on the door couldn't actually name the person or couldn't describe the person who actually caused the fatal blow.
While Will O'Reilly and his CSI gathered evidence, his team also needed to work fast to identify the man known as Spencer. Very quickly, they discovered that this was a man who was known to the police.
Spencer Shepherd was known locally by many, many people as an owner of similar dogs, American 𝗞𝗶𝗹𝗶𝗿 Terriers, one called Colonel and one called Gaddafi. And his name was popping up from various witnesses pretty quickly that evening as a possible suspect.
They knew that Spencer Shepherd was out. They knew that he was with 3 other men, and therefore they had a good starting point for their investigation.
Spencer was part of a very active criminal group, and they were carrying out violent burglary attacks.
The hole in the ceiling gang were prolific, taking over flats that were above premises. They would hold the people hostage that lived in the flats above the shops, and then at the right time they would literally break through the ceiling of the shop and either burgle it or rob it. Some of it was extremely violent.
This gang had a reputation for causing real havoc in New Cross in particular. They were known to be using heavy drugs regularly and pretty much roaming and behaving as they wanted to.
Their life revolved around taking crack cocaine, and fueled by crack cocaine and drink, they were hard to control.
Detectives now had a group of 4 men suspected of initiating the attack, and a crime scene investigation team poised to start collecting evidence.
So, Will, we spoke at the scene earlier on. One of the things I want to talk to you about is the forensic strategy, because there was blood at the scene, a blood trail leading away.
So the crime scene manager with me would make a policy decision about how the forensic strategy was going to go. We'll record that down, and then he would work with the exhibits officer. It's a busy area. It was hard to keep the outer cordon up, so as soon as we could, we reduced that back down to an inner cordon, which we could preserve.
So, looking for fingerprints at the scene, looking for other sort of forensic opportunities.
It's dark, it's late at night. You had to take what you could that day, but preserve the scene so you could do those follow-up inquiries in the morning. To fingerprint the scene, we'd have to do it the next day, as well as doing some of the blood splatter analysis.
And it was the job of crime scene manager D.S. Callum Sutherland to secure such analysis. It was while he was collecting samples at the crime scene that he had noticed an unusual blood pattern.
I was informed that the victim got stabbed just inside, through the alcove bit, through a swing door. He fell there and he was beaten there. So I knew that it kind of started in the alcovey bit. But why was this blood here, down low level in this corner? So I took swabs of it, obviously, and dealt with it. But it still niggled me about the spray, how low level it was, because that indicated to me that somebody had possibly been on the ground and was injured, and the blood spurted up the way. But it just didn't fit with what the stories that I'd been told by other people who I considered to be, reliable witnesses.
In that sort of entrance to the club, there was a lot of spillage of blood, as you can imagine, with a violent attack. But it was clear that there was spots of blood going away from that. So it was vital for us to analyse that blood to secure it as evidence.
What I wanted to do was pretty early on to follow that trail, to be able to see where it took us, and to, if needs be, make the cordon bigger. It stops round the corner, so that right away said, we need to make this cordon bigger. You need to take the cordon further up that road, because this is also needs to be cordoned off this area. It ended just by a cab office, which made me wonder, as one of the suspects injured himself or been injured somehow, and is this his blood, and then he's got a cab. But I think they were able to determine early on that no injured person had got a cab from that cab office, and no cab drivers or anyone in that office was in any way involved.
While the blood samples were sent to the crime lab for immediate analysis, Will's team had also discovered a known address for prime suspect Spencer Shepherd.
Spencer Shepherd's identity was known very early on. His premises, the address that was linked to him, would always be a very early call for the investigative team.
We knew that someone had been murdered, stabbed with a knife by a very violent criminal, so I was concerned about what we would find, would people be in danger. So we ended up arranging for an armed unit to assist us, and we also had a dog van there at that stage because we were aware that a dog was used. We raided that premises, and inside we found a badly injured pit bull terrier. There was no other persons present. The dog was captured by our police dog handlers who are trained in such things and taken away.
The dog handlers would have taken control of the dog. He was injured anyway. Been taken to a vet, cared for.
We might have had an expert who was able to say, yeah, the hairs from that dog match hairs on your victim that are also on the clothing. But of course, part of the problem there is that, yeah, they may be on the victim, but if everybody else knew the owner of the dog, being around his house, you could get innocent transfers. So it was something that you consider and you discuss with hair experts.
By connecting the pit bull to the scene of the crime, detectives would be able to make a connection between the incident and suspect Spencer Shepherd.
There was blood spilt at the crime scene, which is human blood, obviously from George, and there may have been some from the other bouncer there who got injured as well. But clearly the blood trail leading away was neither of these. So we thought at that stage either someone had been injured in the melee, or we knew that a dog had been present. Was the dog injured? So we needed to really sort of take those samples and look at them in the cold light of the day.
So how significant down the line did the fact that you were able to link that dog with that crime scene become?
Well, it was important because we knew a dog had been set up on the bouncer really to subdue him before the attack occurred. We knew that Spencer Shepherd owned 2 pit bull terriers. The dog was found in an address that was associated with him.
So you've definitely got one name, Spencer Shepherd.
Yes.
And you've got Spencer Shepherd's dog.
Yes.
And you want to try and link that dog back to the crime scene.
I think that was crucial to place Spencer Shepherd at that scene, him having gone on the run.
With a prime suspect on the run, SIO Will O'Reilly was about to widen the search. And it was this decision that was to ultimately identify suspect number 2. Dr. Graham Hill is in New Cross, southeast London, revisiting the murder case of 36-year-old doorman and father of 3 George Napier, who was viciously attacked by 4 men and a dog in November 2000. His attackers were on the run and were rumoured to be moving between safe houses around the country.
We don't stop when we think we've got enough evidence. We carry on until we've got all the potential evidence that we can possibly find, tying up that chain which puts people at the scene.
And the search paid off, as more evidence was discovered.
Over the course of the next 24 hours, we had some information coming into us that led us to the discovery of a cache of clothing that was used by the suspects and then discarded because they thought that contained vital evidence. And so we recovered that, and that led us to widen the search area with a specialist search team.
The training thing but said, look, get a Pulsar unit, which is police specialist search advising unit. They've got all the gear for doing it. If you find a knife, put it in a tube and get it up the lab and they can do the examinations on it.
People sometimes think through, it's a weapon, I could be tied to it, or they don't, they throw it away. And a favoured place to dump a weapon is down a drain, and that's where they found the knife.
A knife has been used to stab the victim, George. George's blood, therefore his DNA, was on the knife. That proves that it was the murder weapon. The next thing is to put that murder weapon in someone's hand. Whoever uses it, he puts his DNA and his fingerprints on the knife, and it's the knife that's been used to kill George Napier.
When we get information from the public, we also do our detective work. So we would look at, if 2 or 3 people are named, are they linked? Do we have knowledge about them? Do we have information in past crimes that they've worked together?
We had names, but we had no evidence placing them at the scene other than perhaps Spencer Shepherd. So the discovery of the clothing and the knife was vital to the inquiry.
And it was this discovery that led to a vital DNA match. Forensics from the recovered murder weapon were linked to a second man, also known to the police. It was 27-year-old Dwayne Daniels, one of London's most violent criminals. Daniels had just been released from prison.
A very violent career criminal with over 950 convictions for serious crimes, who would, in a heartbeat, a blink of an eye, hold elderly people in their homes.
Dwayne Daniels was an extremely violent man. He received a 10-year sentence for aggravated burglary where an elderly lady was badly beaten up. He was released from prison, and from the moment he was released, he was on a crime spree. He was committing aggravated burglary, he was committing armed robbery.
And investigators also found evidence that Dwayne Daniels was seen with Spencer Shepherd just before the attack.
We've made further inquiries in other
public houses, which would have been part of the process of the investigation. And we found out that the owner of the dog had been in a pub with 3 other people. We got assistance from people in the pub, and we could tie them into Spencer, who had the dog, who was a person that was refused entry by George at the Paradise Bar, and then one of the people that was in the pub with him was Daniels.
Will and his team have confirmed the names of 2 of the assailants, but there are still 2 unidentified attackers, and all 4 are still at large.
We knew the suspects by name. We knew that one of the suspects had 2 dogs. One was called Colonel and one was called Gaddafi. It was Colonel was the one that was injured in the fight, that was taken there and was stabbed or caught with a knife. Either they knew we were onto them very early, or they panicked, or they decided to clear the area and make good their escape.
There was rumours of where the suspects were in those couple of months where we were looking for them. We were just following up on information. We knew that eventually they would come.
Meanwhile, Will's homicide team was still attempting to confirm that the pit bull terrier owned by suspect Spencer Shepherd could be placed at the crime scene.
They took a sample of the blood that was left on the pavement, and they took a sample from the dog who was seized by the police, and then they looked around for some kind of expert to link the 2 together. So you had to think outside the box with the dog thing. Tell us a little bit about what you did and where it took you and the results that you got.
When we sent the blood samples up to the laboratory, and they extracted DNA from that, but they could say it wasn't human blood. The DNA came back to an animal, a mammal. They suggested at that stage it was going to be probably canine, but they weren't able to do that any further in the UK at that time.
But a forensic lab over 5,000 miles away had the answers investigators were looking for.
It was somebody at the lab who suggested it, and it just came up about this place in America that had used dog DNA in a case.
There was a lab in Sacramento was pioneering work around animal DNA, and so it was an opportunity that couldn't be missed.
In 1998, 2 men were convicted for killing 2 people and their pet in Seattle. The investigators used a lab in Sacramento to take DNA from the slain dog as evidence to identify the killers.
I flew with the samples to Sacramento in California, and they processed them for us.
The reason he did that was to preserve the continuity, because he was then able to say to the court that I took these 2 samples to the United States, and these are the results that I got back from the experts in America. And what were they able to tell you about the samples that you took from the crime scene and the samples that you took from the dog?
They gave us a figure of 1 in a million chance of it not being the same source of blood.
So at that point, you've got an almost positive identification of Spencer Shepherd's dog being at the scene of the crime.
Absolutely.
That then corroborated a witness's version of events. It also would then show that if the owner of the dog turned around and said, "Oh no, I was never there," but it helps you to show that they're lying.
Once we placed Spencer Shepherd at the scene of the crime, then we could look at what the forensic evidence is around the other 3.
With the dog's DNA adding to the evidence collected, detectives were confident that the 2 known suspects were responsible for the attack on doorman George Napier.
The knife that was found down the drain was found to have blood from George on the knife and the DNA of Dwayne Daniels on the knife. And also the clothing that was discarded was also found to contain the blood of George and the DNA of Dwayne Daniels. Therefore, they were able to link Dwayne Daniels with the murder of George Napier.
And in February 2001, with the 4 suspects having been on the run for 3 months, investigators got their big break.
We're all creatures of habits, and criminals seem to be more creatures of habit than we are. They tend to commit crime in the area they know because you feel safe there. The danger with that is other people know you.
So the first person to be arrested was Dwayne Daniels, who got arrested at the scene of a very, very violent robbery.
3 months after George's murder, Dwayne Daniels was arrested committing an aggravated burglary at the Halifax Building Society in Twickenham. He was chased by the police and chased by a police dog, and during that chase he injured the police officer and the dog with a knife. He was arrested and also charged with the murder of George Napier.
And when word got around that Dwayne Daniels was in custody, the remaining 3 suspects gave themselves into the police, fearing that if they didn't, they would also be charged with murder. The 2 unknown suspects were now identified as Daniel Clark and Spencer Shepherd's brother, Lewis Shepherd.
And finally, the last person who gives himself up to the police is Spencer Shepherd, the man that owned the dog.
It just gets too much for them, keeping on the run, looking over your shoulder, thinking every knock on the door is going to be a police officer.
With all 4 suspects in custody, investigators needed to ensure the case they had built against them would stand up in court.
At this stage, you've got Dwayne Daniels, who appears to be the killer, the man with the knife. Yes. You've got Spencer Shepherd, who appears to be the man with the dog. His brother, who I understand is called Lewis Shepherd.
Yep.
And then you've got another guy who is Daniel Clark. So you've got the 4 main people involved in the murder of George.
Yes.
And then you take them to court.
The evidence we discussed at the moment places sort of all 4 at the scene, really, and Dwayne Daniels at some stage in possession of the bloodstained knife with George Napier's blood on it. But that doesn't place the knife in Dwayne Daniels' hands.
Despite the mounting evidence against him, police were concerned that Daniels could still argue that he was not the one who delivered the fatal blow, and more proof would be needed to convince a jury of his guilt. Former SIO and criminologist Dr. Graham Hill is talking to Will O'Reilly, who led the investigation into the murder of doorman and father of 3 George Napier at the Paradise Bar, New Cross, in November 2000.
This is a poster for the Paradise Bar. You can see it's open from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m, where it changed from a public house to a nightclub.
So it's a pub come club?
Yes, absolutely. And George, who was actually the doorman at the Paradise Bar that evening with another doorman.
So George is the man that refused Spencer Shepherd entry to the club?
That's correct. He refused him entry the first occasion because Spencer Shepherd tried to get in without paying, and then he came back with his friends and assaulted George.
And this is Dwayne Daniels, very violent man.
Very violent man, had a history of violence and was committing offences whilst on parole from a previous sentence.
And this is the blood trail?
Yes, the Paradise Bar is on the corner there, and we noticed the blood going away from the scene of the crime, round the corner in Florence Road.
While detectives were waiting for trial, the 2 additional assailants at the scene provided even more information than detectives had anticipated.
When Dwayne Daniels was arrested, he went no comment on the police interview. However, the other suspects that were arrested implicated Dwayne as the man that brought a knife to the scene. Even though he'd been told not to bring a knife to the scene, he brought a knife to the scene and he administered the fatal blow to George.
A year after the killing, the murder of George Napier came to trial at the Central Criminal Court in London, known as the Old Bailey.
The 4 defendants were scowling, trying to look as dismissive as possible. Obviously, their lawyers wanted them to be on their best behaviour to give a good impression for the jury, but that wasn't something that came across very well.
All 4 were originally charged with the murder of George Napier. However, in consultation with the Crown Prosecution Service, it was decided that Lewis Shepherd, Spencer Shepherd and Daniel Clark would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm.
That would have covered them coming together when Spencer went to them and said what had happened, he'd been refused entry, go back and attack George, and really it put them on the front approach to admitting a lesser crime of murder.
That was because they said that before setting out, they only intended to teach the bouncer, George Napier, a lesson. They wanted to beat him up pretty badly, but they had no intention to actually kill him. And they were suggesting that Dwayne took it upon himself to take a knife, and it was nothing to do with them.
If they know the evidence is strong placing them at the scene of the crime, and they believe in their own mind that they did, very little wrong insofar as they warned him not to take a knife, it probably suited them to actually confess their part to play in it.
Anything before the murder, if they're planning it or moving towards it with an act, being at the scene, going there and being armed, including being with a dog, brings you into that conspiracy.
When you got to court, Dwayne decided to go not guilty on the murder charge, and the other three pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm.
That's correct.
So that leaves you with a trial involving Dwayne Daniels.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how that unfolded.
All the evidence was adduced in court, for instance, especially the forensic evidence was quite vital and quite damning, really.
Evidence was given about the forensic link between Daniels and the knife found near the scene and the clothing found near the scene, and the fact that he was in company with the other three on the night George was murdered. And the crucial piece of evidence was that he made a confession whilst on remand in prison to another inmate who came to court and gave evidence for the prosecution.
We were fortunate insofar as we had a confession by a prisoner he was locked up with on remand, who actually gave evidence at the Old Bailey against him to say that he had a cell confession with Dwayne Daniels where he admitted stabbing George Napier.
They had provided pivotal evidence, and so they were rewarded for that. That reward, it's based on how the information helped with the inquiry.
He denied it, pleaded not guilty, but was found guilty, with the jury only taking, I believe, less than an hour or so to find his guilt.
Dwayne Daniels was a very violent man. In fact, before he was convicted of the murder of George Napier, he'd admitted to over 900 violent criminal offences. Most of them were aggravated burglaries and robberies. So that gives you an indication of the level of violence that he had in his life. And because of that, he was sentenced to life imprisonment when he was convicted of George Napier's murder. And because of all his other violent offences that were then before the court, he was actually sentenced to 6 life terms of imprisonment. When someone is sentenced to life imprisonment or multiple life imprisonment, those offences or those sentences will run concurrently. So what normally happens is they'll be doing 6 life terms of imprisonment, but they'll all be running at the same time. In this particular case, Dwayne Daniels went back to court and the judge made a determination that he could not apply for parole until he had done at least 19 years in prison.
The senseless murder of George Napier has left his family to a lifetime of bereavement.
George had a partner and 3 kids. He was doing the doorman job simply to get a bit of money. It was money that he could make of an evening because his partner could look after children. He could go out and work as well as working in the daytime. He was, a hard-working man.
By all account, a gentle giant and a really easygoing, nice guy. Someone who clearly didn't deserve to be killed in a violent, unprovoked attack.
Killed over £5. £5 for an entry fee.
What we've got here is an innocent man doing his job, loses his life for £5. What a waste of life, and it just shows you how violent some people can be and how things can get out of hand very quickly.
A phrase that was used in London at the time and elsewhere was Spencer was dissed. He was disrespected and he went back to try and get what he thought in his mind respect back.
The incident that took place was simply because Spencer Shepherd wanted revenge. He wanted to go back and teach the doorman a lesson because he'd been refused entry to the club.
With Daniels and his gang safe behind bars, investigators could take comfort that all their hard work had helped to protect a community.
It seems to me that there's 4 strategies that came together to help you and your team solve the murder of George Napier.
Mhm.
The first one being the witness strategy.
Yes.
The next one being the forensic strategy, which was really crucial.
Yeah.
You've then got your intelligence strategy, you source information from various places. And finally, you've got your family liaison strategy, which is, of course, best practice for
Yeah, absolutely. And there were some minor ones like the media strategy and other bits and pieces, search strategy, for instance. But they all interlinked with the main 4.
You had really skilled detectives, committed, motivated, wanted to get answers, but also drew on the skills of a whole range of people and the forensic side, the family liaison, the detectives on the street, the people searching for exhibits, and the people who did the interviews. Thoroughly professional team, really proud to be a part of them.
All the officers on the team worked extraordinarily hard. I think quite often, the scientists work hard, but they do kind of tend to get forgotten, scientists, at times. I think it's nice that when you get a result that somebody picks the phone up and says, hey, you did all this DNA work, or you did this on this case, we got a result, well done. Because they quite often, they never ever get to hear what happened in a case, and they really do deserve praise, because scientific work is painstaking.
That's the greatest honour a detective can have, is when you have that pass to undertake a murder investigation and fulfil the outcome of convicting the people that killed them.
When SIOs get to a murder scene, they really don't know where it's going to take them. And one of the important things is to run those strategies simultaneously and see where the evidence takes you. And in this case, the evidence took them to these 4 suspects, and Will O'Reilly and his team were able to use that information intelligently to secure a conviction and take a very, very dangerous man off the streets. Clearly, they're never going to bring George back, but at least for George's family, they will have some knowledge of what happened, why it happened, and some comfort from the fact that that person is locked up for a long period of time and may never see the light of day again.